still in Pienza, and wherever we went, we were able to spend a great deal of time painting. And this was at the end of the day. We were walking back towards our bus and walking through the main street of Pienza. Some people were having ice cream, and people were walking back and forth. And I noticed that as they walked through the shadows, there were breaks in the shadows, and the highlights would fall on, edges of their clothing or on top of their heads. Or it was visually very intriguing to me, and I decided to make this a focus for the next painting, which is showing figures walking through the streets of Pienza. And I'm still thinking very much about how to use the midtone, identifying it first of all, reminding myself, is it a light midtone? Is it a dark midtone? Where are my darks going to be, and where are my lights going to be? Obviously, the lights I want to have fall on the figures, the central figures, as they're walking through the shadows in Pienza. And the midtone will be used in the buildings, on the ground, creating the shadows. Some strong darks will be in the central figures as well as surrounding figures. And that's my basic plan for this painting. Now I'm starting with a light color, and I'm actually painting my figures first. This is maybe a substitute for drawing. I like to work with the brush more than the pencil, so I'm more in the habit now of starting my work with a very light wash. And if I'm painting light figures, it helps me to see them so that I can paint around them. I'm envisioning the dark midtone, the big midtone, to flow down from the building on the left across the ground, basically coming across half of the figures and then riding up the buildings on the right-hand side. So I'm starting to prepare for that shadow now. I've identified the lighter areas of the buildings. I'm dropping in some water to precede this big shadow, because I want soft edges up there. And then I'm following that with a pretty dark wash made up of ultramarine blue, a little cobalt blue, perhaps a bit of burnt sienna, a cool wash. And what I'm doing here is trying to get that interesting shape. The shadows present very interesting shapes, and I'm trying to capture that shape as well as the tonality, the dark tonality. And I'm trying to do it with interesting brush strokes. So you see me using the brush as a calligrapher might, to really create some interesting edges and an expression to the brush strokes. Once that's in place, I can move to work within the shadows, maybe place some darks for windows or edges of buildings, perhaps some public lighting. I'm going to stay with this area, and it's a good watercolor technique. I'll mention it now since we're here, is to, if you're working in an area and you have some time, like this wash of the shadow is still drying, it's an opportunity to place some deeper strokes and get some soft edges. Same time, I can extend that shadow. You see that big stroke to the right. I'm extending that shadow upwards into the buildings. And now it's a matter of kind of continuing over to the left-hand side. I'm going to establish the building and then paint some of this cooler mix into it. Starting with a lot of burnt sienna, a little bit of neutral tint, and some blue to gray it. And I'm creating that strong vertical that's basically kind of running into the blue, the lower section of the blue that we just created, creating a sort of funnel of light that's moving down to our figures. That's what's in my mind's eye anyway. And I've got to drop some blues into this to cool it off a little bit. And as I'm doing that on the lower section, I'm also picking up some distant figures. These figures were painted with that light color in the beginning, and allow me to, pick up on their silhouettes, and you see the silhouettes of the figures emerging now as bright areas within this strong midtone. Might as well add some work while I can, while this wash is still a little wet. I want to join the rooftop, maybe put in some windows or moldings that break up the big shape, that big shape there. That's what I'm doing now. And I'm ready to kind of work across the bottom. You notice two little yellow areas down there. Those happen to be dogs. I know they don't look like dogs right now. I'm hoping by the end of the painting there'll be a semblance of dogs. I mention them because this wash on the ground is tricky. I have to kind of avoid the dogs. And that makes me slow down and kind of work more methodically across the ground area, when my intention is to join these two washes of the building, the ground, and the right-hand shadow. So this is a difficult stage in the painting because I've got to be working with a large wash, and I want there to be a gradual change to that wash. At the same time, I've got to avoid some of these smaller shapes, so it's a little tricky. And I'm just leaving the top parts of these dogs visible. I'm trying not to stress about it too much. I want to keep a sort of flow to the work. That's a good point to think about. When you're doing a larger wash like this, there's a flow to it. If you end up breaking it up into smaller bits, you lose some of the beauty. So I'm trying to work it while it's wet here and keep that flow going while, aware of where I need to stop it against the figures and against the smaller areas where the dogs are. But that flow and smooth transition is very much in my mind. Okay, so we're refining the shapes a little bit, getting some shadows moving across the main figures and the minor figures to the back. Let's take a break from that and deal with something a little more, a little different, a little less intense. This means the sky, and then developing some of the colors in the figures, and then we'll put in that rooftops to the right-hand side after this blue has a chance to set up. Okay, details in some of the figures to give them a little character while we're waiting for the sky to dry. Wow, that was bright. Did you expect that? I had no idea I was going to put her in a red dress. I thought it kind of happened in my mind's eye, and then a split second later, there it was. And that certainly is going to bring a attraction to that center area just by means of color. Color, contrast, those are 2 points which are going to be working together to kind of bring us a high degree of focus to those central figures. I'm working on the figures while I can, while they're evolving, and later on I'll return to the minor figures and deal with them in a little more of a broad sense. By that I mean toning them down quite a bit, pushing them into the shadows even more, and leaving perhaps the shoulders and the head a little more visible to give it the recognition. So the figure is evolving, and okay, we'll go into the dog perhaps a little bit. What are we going to do with these dogs? We've got to make them recognizable. Otherwise, they become a distraction in the painting. And I guess I'm going to leave them for the moment and return to those minor figures, do some work to see how I'm toning down the figures, putting them into the shadows. Otherwise, they're going to be a little competitive with the main figures. So this is a balancing act at this stage. We're trying to key off of our main figures, in other words, use them as a point of measurement, and adjust the minor figures, and the dogs are considered minor figures, even though they're so cute. They're minor figures that must kind of follow to the dynamic and the vision of the painting. So I'm adjusting the back figures, putting some darks into them, putting some things that might be recognizable, jacket, pants, handbags, this sort of thing that augment the figures, but at the same time push them deeper into the shadows. Okay, this little dog's become a husky. We can tell by the ears and the coloring. And the other dog is something like a mutt, small dog, apartment-sized dogs. You see a lot of this everywhere you go now. It's really charming to me to see the animals joining the couple and having a day out in the countryside. All right, some windows, some treatment to the roof, and starting to gain a finished quality. And now it's a matter of, how much detail do we put into our figures? How much do we kind of push back against the minor figures to ask them to retreat into the painting? And you can see by the finished appearance that the dried painting, the colors have come out much more bright. That bright feeling along the bottom of through the upper parts of the figures is really grabbing our attention. And we got the mid-value to surround our figures. So that was our day in Pienza.